Spotify might be in a fight for its own survival. There are no real signs or articles about it, but I think if you start reading the tea leaves correctly across all the different news that came out about Spotify, you will see that that brand might be in trouble. So today I want to go through the signs that I see, some of the events that are happening currently in the creator economy, and why I think Spotify might be at risk, especially considering that it is facing stiff competition from both Google and Apple. Over the past few months, I have seen articles like this one, where you can essentially see that actually Spotify is actively pursuing brands to advertise to them their video offering. At first, I just glanced at it as something pretty standard for the tech world. Ultimately, this is quite normal. You will see a lot more brands essentially copying each other in the tech space. Snapchat came up with the stories, and all of a sudden, every single platform, including even Slack, who attempted to introduce stories into their platform, they all wanted to copy that feature. Short form came out, all of a sudden, slowly all platforms, including even LinkedIn, started to adopt short form. So to me, seeing Spotify actively talking and courting brands to advertise against their video content did not seem to be that unusual. Especially if you take into account that, if we go back to some of these news articles, they've been active when it comes to acquisition of video content. They had this deal with Nebula quite recently. Originally, Joe Rogan's podcast signing up for Spotify was one of the massive, probably the first $100 million podcast deal that we've seen. Then Emma Chamberlain came over, then Call Her Daddy. Alex Cooper brought her content over to Spotify. So it's been pretty standard motion for Spotify to just continuously acquire more and more video assets. Since the more videos they have on their platform, the more they can offer of inventory to their potential customers to place ads against. So that makes complete sense. But then this news article came out and it got me thinking. As you can tell, YouTube actually became the largest podcasting platform. And if it is not a point of concern maybe immediately, this is something for Spotify now to start considering heavily. Essentially, if the most amount of podcast views are currently coming not from Apple Podcasts or from Spotify, from any other, Wonderies of the world, different sub platforms, if everyone is going to YouTube and YouTube already has the video on the lock, all of a sudden that world becomes a little bit tighter for Spotify. And then you start thinking, extrapolating further. Wait a minute. YouTube is owned by Alphabet and Google. Those are the same two companies that own Android. And outside of the United States, Android dominates the entire world when it comes to software on the phones. And frequently, those phones come preloaded with Google apps, including YouTube. And now you take it from there and you start thinking, wait a minute. From the perspective of Android-based phones, YouTube already is a dominant platform and Google can continuously promote it to more and more users who buy their first phone on Android-based platform. Then you start thinking back to Apple and hold up. Apple iPhones come preloaded with Apple podcasting software. Mind-blowing concept. But in reality, when you start thinking, all of a sudden, that world, that piece of the world is slowly going over to Apple, right? So a lot of audio podcasts are essentially predominantly consumed, if they're on that platform, consumed by Apple users through the Apple podcasting app. Then you look at Google Android and they have a video and they also have their own podcasting RSS feed and apps that can support you essentially consuming podcasts from all over the world on those Android platforms. The world that is left for Spotify really comes down to Spotify Music. And guess what? The largest streaming service right now is Apple. Apple Music, again, comes standard preloaded on Apple iPhones, dominates the current space. And with all of this going down, you can see how for Spotify, that can be a very nervous period of time. They are not that dominant of a player who's like running away with it when it comes to podcasting. They're actually number two. They're in the music. They're roughly number two. Maybe sometimes on certain months they hit number one. When it comes to audio experience, again, they have plenty of competitors. And to top it all off, all of their key competitors are preloaded automatically and co-owned by hardware manufacturers. This is a lot of headwinds to fight against. And so it's no wonder if I look back at one last article, Spotify recently announced that they're ready to pay YouTubers millions of dollars, and they're essentially trying to acquire more unique content on their platform. And this is a very fair strategy. When it comes to cost of switching between all of these platforms, it's actually relatively low. I have all of those apps installed on my phone. Very likely you do too. So for Spotify, there is an opportunity to acquire some of those eyeballs and get them into the app. And they better get those people into the app, because once folks are in the app, they can hopefully consume other pieces of content that they have on Spotify video experience. And this will give them justification to essentially sell those ad spots to the sponsors and hopefully use those funds to acquire more talented creators to go join Spotify video and continue to create unique content that you cannot find somewhere on Google platforms or Apple platforms. But this is a very high hill to climb, because when it comes to this kind of offerings, you have to ensure that those creators who come and join your platform, they don't feel like they're losing out. Yes, the cash will be there, but when it comes to the awareness, they might actually have a lot less eyeballs available to them on Spotify compared to YouTube. And that can be a big factor if, say, you're a creator who is selling physical or digital product and you rely on those conversions on the websites. That's a lot that you're going to give up for maybe a more stable paycheck in the short term. And at the pace that the YouTube is moving as a creator, by the time maybe you're out of that exclusive deal, your audience will be gone on YouTube. Maybe someone else will enter and take your spot because you're going to leave that vacuum because of your exclusive deal with Spotify. And so all of a sudden, yes, you got some cash up front in the short term, but long term, you negatively affected your business. These are all the considerations that's going to be going hopefully through the mind of the creator, their management team, as they're potentially negotiating some of these deals with Spotify. And the final point that we also should take into account, Spotify is a public company. Yes, they're actually doing pretty well. If we look on like a 6-month or even year to date, it looks like, their stock has been growing, but they're a publicly traded company that doesn't have the cash war chest that, say, YouTube has thanks to Google because of all the Google advertising business, or they don't have the amount of cash that Apple has when it comes to all those hardware sales that they have. So Spotify is kind of like on their own when it comes to protecting their turf and investing in their business. And as a public company, that's a huge consideration. Their CFO, their CEO, all of their top executives are all evaluated on the performance of the stock. And essentially, they cannot overinvest. They cannot make too many risky bets because that's going to be their jobs on the line. And I know we all like to think that, oh, the public companies are always adventurous and, they're all about trying to push the envelope. Not really, because the people who make the decisions are those executives. And those executives, if they make too risky of a decision and that decision will fail, will lose their job. And that's their livelihood, it's their mortgage. That is why never ignore the personal factor, no matter how large the company is, because ultimately it's people who make those decisions. So put this all together and summarize. You have the pressure from the software perspective and the viewers simply not willing to leave the app like YouTube. You have the hardware pressure and essentially both Google and Apple pre-installing their own platforms on their hardware, and that final limitation of how much flexibility you have as a public company to go out there and do something interesting. And now it all makes sense that Spotify is really trying to focus on attracting more content and attracting some of those top creators. So what is next for Spotify? Well, I think they're on the right track when it comes to thinking about acquiring exclusive rights with some of these creators, but I think what's important is habitual viewing. For me, like when I go to grab lunch by myself, or say it's evening, everyone's in bed and I have a very late dinner, I almost like habitually open YouTube app and I consume some YouTube content. They need to ensure that as they sign up some of those creators, it's not for those one-off big projects. It's for something that's going to create that habitual viewing and listening, so that the viewer almost like by habit starts opening Spotify app every single day. From there, they need to expand and start thinking about, okay, what are some of these additional pieces of information and types of content they can introduce, so that there's some diversification of the type of content that the viewer can consume so they don't get bored, and you slowly build up from there. But that initial pocket of audience should really be coming from already existing users, because you really want to make sure you keep the existing users happy and then build up from there, maybe through certain acquisition programs for some of these creators, maybe through unique exclusive shows that will make enough of a splash to attract the audience back in. And the other part can be the revenue sharing program, some sort of monetization program that doesn't necessarily lock in the creators into exclusive rights, but gives them another opportunity to monetize. The thing about those exclusive agreements, for example, a lot of streaming services have done them, some of these platforms do them. It's great for individual creator, but a single individual creator will not drive masses. Like, there are top creators out there who probably have millions and millions of subscribers that you enjoy watching that I've never heard about. And same goes for a lot of these spaces that you may think that Joe Rogan can be this huge name that you attract onto the platform, but in reality, there's millions and millions and millions of people who've never even heard about Joe Rogan, right? So this is a good example of individual approach where, yes, you can acquire and make that splash in the news, but when it comes to masses and habitual viewing, it's not necessarily the best step forward. But instead, if you create some sort of monetization program for the creators to go and cross post their content and essentially start monetizing their videos both on YouTube and, say, Spotify, that can be a much better move. Think about Instagram Reels. So many people are making fun of IG Reels because of the fact that they're like, oh, they're essentially copycats of TikTok. People just throw the same type of content from TikTok on Instagram and that's it. But it was kind of the point, and it was a genius point from Meta, because slowly, as people start throwing more and more content from, say, TikTok short form content on their Instagram, that start building up the habit, and some folks who already were consuming photos on Instagram, they're like automatically start switching to Reels, and like, habitually here and there start watching Reels, and then certain subcultures start forming on Reels, and now I see a lot more unique content produced for Instagram. And quite frankly, with all the noise happening around, ByteDance and TikTok and all the political situations, IG Reels had actually been picking up pretty well, and there's a lot more now content that is very unique to Instagram. And because of the fact people are already there for habitual viewing of, say, photos, they naturally go and watch the Reels. So for Spotify, they need to replicate something like that. They need to replicate that habitual viewing, but the only way to do it is that you need to enable folks to upload their content from YouTube, but also to monetize it there. Because for the creators, when I work with the creators, one of the big themes is, how do I diversify my revenue? And if Spotify comes out there and says, here's the new revenue sharing model, go take advantage of all this content that you already created, they will all of a sudden see flood of content being posted on Spotify. And sure, the initial viewing will not necessarily be there, but they just need to stick with it and figure out how can they natively place that video content within the feed on Spotify, because that's what, again, Instagram did pretty well. Through the photos, you slowly start seeing more and more Reels popping up, and it just developed that habit, and people became more open to consuming video content on Instagram. So for Spotify, you kind of need to crawl, walk, run in that direction. And the good news is that all of this means a lot more positives for the creators, because as creators will gain additional opportunities to monetize their content, you will essentially offer them an opportunity to go and test some ideas that might not work and be super friendly for the YouTube algorithm, but they might really work well on Spotify. And eventually you can see very Spotify focused creators. Like today you have Instagram focused creators, TikTok focused creators, Snapchat grabbed quite a few of them, and there's its own culture and audience sitting on Snapchat consuming short form content. Very similarly, I'm very confident that you can have the long form content consumed on YouTube and Spotify, and you can create different subcultures. It takes time, and I don't think it's achieved by just throwing millions of dollars at a handful of few creators. Spotify really needs to focus on how to attract the masses of the creators who are struggling to monetize on YouTube and find unique space on YouTube. And those will be the creators who will be very grateful if Spotify will give them nice safe harbor to, dock their ship in and monetize their content the way that they cannot do it today on YouTube. So interesting times. I love this kind of developments. It was very interesting to kind of like see these tea leaves. I hope you saw them as well. It makes sense to you on why you see now Spotify pushing so hard into the YouTube advertisement. And originally, when I thought that this was just for the sake of copying the features, I was wrong, because I think it's clearly Spotify recognizing that they're being squeezed from all directions, and the video might be the only way for them to save their business. Let me know what you think. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know in the comment section below. Let me know if there are other interesting trends or some behaviors from companies you want me to dissect and explore more from the perspective of the creator economy. Otherwise, I'll see you next Saturday. Peace.